Literature-loving friends, I still recall the first time I sank into Bourne Ultimatum, back in 2007, and how it felt less like watching a movie than being yanked headfirst into a restless pulse that didn't let up until the credits rolled. There was something urgent about the way it opened, Jason Bourne on a run again, wounded and cornered, with the whole weight of nameless agencies closing in, and yet beneath the chases and surveillance feeds you could sense that this was also a story about identity. What does it mean to reclaim your name, your past, your choices, when powerful hands keep erasing them faster than you can recover them? The film wastes no time on slow preambles. We're thrown into Moscow streets and hospital corridors, a man with bruises as his only luggage, stitched together with the rhythm of exhaustion, and every cut of the camera feels like a heartbeat skipping out of sync. What struck me then, and still strikes me now, is how the movie keeps tricking you. It looks like pure momentum, pure chase, but inside that motion is a riddle about memory, about how much of yourself you can retrieve before you no longer want to. Bourne isn't running only from bullets and agents. He's running toward the truth of who made him a weapon and why. And the genius isn't how the story withholds answers until they burn. A coded phone call here, a face glimpse in the crowd, a dossier page that vanishes before you can read the last line. For us, the audience, this turns watching into pursuit. We're decoding alongside him, never quite ahead, never comfortably behind. I remember leaning forward when he found unlikely allies, reporters, and old contacts who knew just enough to help but not enough to survive the knowledge, and how the film kept underlining the cost of proximity to him. Help Bourne and you invite ruin. The suspense wasn't just whether he would survive, but whether his conscience could bear the wreckage trailing behind. And all the while, cities became chessboards: London, Madrid, Tangier, New York, each mapped in quick edits, as if the globe itself were being cut up and shuffled like a deck of cards, and Bourne's face kept appearing as the wild card nobody could control. The brilliance of this opening stretch is that it lets you feel hunted even when you're safe in your seat. I remember glancing at my phone in the cinema lobby afterward and half expecting someone to trace me through it. That's how deeply it burrowed under my skin. The movie builds that paranoia not with speeches but with silence. The close-ups of a man scanning a crowd, the buzz of fluorescent lights in government offices, the way a quiet apartment suddenly feels like a trap. It is cinema as adrenaline, but it is also cinema as an inquiry into power. Who has the right to define a human being, and what happens when that human being refuses a definition? So when the first act tightens and the second looms, what we're left holding isn't just suspense but hunger, a need to know how far Bourne will go, and whether learning the final truth will free him or finish him. That's the genius of this film setup. It offers us not just a chase, but a chase into the soul, a reminder that identity can be the most dangerous battlefield of all. Literature-loving friends, the first half of the Bourne Ultimatum unfolds with such breathless urgency that it's easy to forget you're watching a carefully engineered film, and not simply eavesdropping on a world spinning slightly out of control. We begin with Bourne limping through the Moscow night, his body broken but his determination intact, and it's from this fragile but unyielding place that the narrative launches itself. What defines these opening movements is the way the filmmakers refuse us the luxury of pause. Every time he attempts to rest, the past stirs, the agencies circle tighter, the phones buzz with orders to terminate. It isn't just action, it's architecture, an entire system of surveillance arranged to crush a single man who dares to demand his own name back. In London, a reporter becomes both conduit and cautionary tale. The way Bourne scans a crowded train station, listening not just with his ears, but with the instinct of a man who knows predators, is one of those sequences that felt like it redefined chase scenes for a generation. He orchestrates the movements of another human being as if guiding a piece across a chessboard, whispering instructions that sound like salvation until they don't. The tension ratchets up not through explosions but through glances, through the narrowing of a corridor, through the press of feet on tile floors. The tragedy that follows, that devastating moment when information becomes liability, sets the tone for the rest of the film. Helping Bourne is perilous, and knowledge itself can kill. Madrid follows, its sunlit rooftops and cramped apartments serving as another battleground. The film's rhythm never slackens. The editing slices us forward in fragments, forcing our eyes to do the work of piecing together continuity. Bourne here is both ghost and tactician, moving with uncanny precision, anticipating blows before they fall, using door frames, mirrors, even kitchen utensils as tools of defense. It is in these sequences that the movie demonstrates its genius. Violence not a spectacle but as improvisation, choreography shaped by necessity. Every punch feels earned. Every narrow escape feels temporary, because we are always reminded that the system chasing him is vast and faceless, with endless resources. A single victory is a breath, not a reprieve. Tangier erupts in a flurry of rooftops, motorbikes, and alleyways, perhaps the most kinetic set piece of the first half. What lingers isn't just the speed of the chase, but the raw physicality of it. Bourne smashing through windows, clawing across uneven rooftops, improvising routes that feel both reckless and inevitable. The camera doesn't float serenely. It tumbles with him, stumbles after him, gasps in sync with his lungs. The fight that follows, close quarters, brutal, with every piece of furniture becoming a weapon, is less about style than about survival. When the dust clears, the silence afterward feels heavier than the noise that preceded it. Here the film reminds us that the cost of persistence is exhaustion, and that even victories leave scars. All the while, the CIA looms in sterile rooms lit by glowing screens, voices clipped and urgent, every order wrapped in the language of protocol. The cross-cutting between Bourne's raw, sweaty flight and the antiseptic calm of intelligence offices becomes a commentary of its own. Humanity against machinery, blood against bureaucracy. Characters like Pamela Landy emerge as complications rather than simple adversaries, her doubts gnawing at the institutional facade. Through her, we glimpse the possibility that conscience might survive even in corridors built for compromise. She becomes a mirror to Bourne's own quest, someone who recognizes that truth, once glimpsed, can never be unlearned. What the first half accomplishes, beyond its relentless momentum, is an atmosphere of paranoia that seeps into the viewer's skin. Phones ring and we tense. A camera pans across a crowd and we search for threats. The editing trains us to see as Bourne sees, patterns, shadows, possibilities. It's a rare thriller that doesn't just show paranoia but teaches us to live in it. And yet, beneath that surface, the film threads a quieter theme, the longing for closure. Bourne isn't chasing revenge. He's chasing himself, that sliver of memory that will finally allow him to look in the mirror without seeing only violence. By the midpoint, as the action barrels toward New York, we are breathless, not because we've been dazzled by stunt alone, but because we've been carried into a rhythm where survival and revelation are indistinguishable. The first half leaves us in a state of suspended urgency. Bourne has evaded capture yet again, but we understand that evasion is no longer enough. He is closing in on the architects of his identity, and the second half would demand not just running but confronting, not just surviving but remembering. And so we lean forward, hearts pounding, ready to follow him into the storm he can no longer escape. Literature-loving friends, the second half of the Bourne Ultimatum is where the film sheds its skin as a chase thriller and reveals itself as something deeper, an unflinching confrontation with memory, guilt, and the machinery of power that for so long dictated Bourne's every breath. By the time we arrive in New York, the narrative has tightened into a coil, each frame carrying the inevitability of collision. We've moved past the stage where survival was enough. Now Bourne must turn his flight inward, into the recesses of his past, into rooms where his transformation was engineered. What's remarkable about this descent is that it isn't painted in broad strokes of vengeance, but in subtler hues of reckoning. Every step he takes feels like an approach not toward an enemy, but toward the ghost of himself. The New York sequences pulse with the rhythm of inevitability. Streets teem with civilians oblivious to the war waged in their midst, while offices hum with clipped orders to terminate, as if lives were simply errors in code. Bourne glides through this landscape of the paradoxical calm, as if the closer he comes to his origins, the steadier he becomes. The editing, still frenetic, now feels almost ritualistic. Cuts no longer only disorient but prepare us for revelation. We know the labyrinth is about to open at its core. Nikki Parsons returns as an echo of the past and a catalyst of present. Her presence deepens the narrative, her knowledge of the Treadstone and Blackbriar programs framing Bourne's search as part of a larger betrayal. Their interactions brim not with romance but with recognition. Two people bound by the machinery that sought to erase their humanity. Her choice to stand with him feels less like loyalty to a man and more like defiance against the system. Through her, we glimpse the broader stakes. Bourne is not just reclaiming his name, but challenging an entire architecture of secrecy and control. The confrontation with Noah Vosen crystallizes the moral geometry of the film. Vosen embodies the bureaucratic coldness of power, a man whose sentences are measured in collateral damage, whose comfort with termination is disguised as pragmatism. The sequences in which he attempts to corner Bourne through a city alive with surveillance become less about action than about ideology. One man wielding the machinery of the state, another man armed only with memory and will. Their duel is staged not just in gunfire and chases, but in the very language they use, one speaking in euphemisms of procedure, the other in the raw vocabulary of survival. Yet the true heart of the second half lies not in these duels, but in Bourne's entry into the training facility, where his identity was dismantled and rebuilt. These stark corridors, these sterile rooms, are the crucible of his transformation. The film slows here, the camera lingering on walls that once echoed with indoctrination. And then, piece by piece, memory returns, not as clarity but as wound. He sees himself consenting to become a weapon, surrendering his name, participating in his own erasure. The revelation is devastating because it isn't imposed on him by an external villain but chosen, however manipulated, by himself. His guilt is not just for the killings that followed, but for the original consent that birthed the killer. This is the paradox of the Bourne Ultimatum. The enemy he pursues is himself. The showdown that follows against Paz, the assassin who mirrors Bourne's own past, is a perfect embodiment of this paradox. Paz is what Bourne was meant to remain, unquestioning, lethal, unreflective. Their encounter on the rooftop becomes less a fight than a philosophical duel. Bourne spares him, not because of mercy alone, but because sparing him is the ultimate rejection of the program. In refusing to replicate the cycle of violence, Bourne reclaims his humanity. His words of Paz, simple, piercing, echo as a manifesto. The choice not to kill is a reclamation of self. The final pursuit, with agents swarming, sirens cutting through the night, builds to the rooftop plunge into the river. It is at once an escape and a baptism. As Bourne's body sinks beneath the water, we see the image of a man unburdened, transformed by truth, freed from the shackles of secrecy. The government believes him dead. Files are shuffled, and voices on the phone speak of resolution. But in the last frames, as his body stirs, as he swims away into anonymity, we understand that resolution is an illusion. What has been reclaimed cannot be undone. He is alive, and the machinery that tried to erase him has failed. The second half of the film thus delivers not just on action but on philosophy. It insists that identity is both fragile and resilient, that guilt can wound but also redeem, that systems designed to dehumanize can be resisted by the simplest act, remembering who you are. For us, literature-loving friends, the chase has become a metaphor for selfhood itself, the running a refusal to submit, the survival a declaration that humanity is stronger than bureaucracy. And as the credits roll, we are left not only breathless, but haunted by the truth that the most dangerous secret is not what the state hides, but what the self forgets. Literature-loving friends, what makes the Bourne Ultimatum such a riveting piece of cinema is not only its intricate plotting or frenetic pacing, but the way its characters are carved into sharp relief against the machinery of espionage, each one embodying a different relationship to power, memory, and morality. At the center, of course, is Jason Bourne himself. No longer the confused fugitive of the first film, nor the vengeful seeker of the second, but a man who has become almost monastic in his focus. What defines him here is restraint. The ability to move through chaos from an economy of gesture, to deploy violence as necessity rather than impulse, to let silence do the speaking when words would only betray vulnerability. And yet beneath that restraint, the film lets us glimpse a storm, memories surfacing in jagged fragments, guilt pressing against his composure, and profound loneliness that no amount of tactical brilliance can disguise. He is not merely searching for names and dates, but for absolution, though he scarcely admits it even to himself. This Bourne is the culmination of the trilogy's arc, a man whose humanity is revealed precisely because he resists becoming the machine he was trained to be. Supporting him and complicating him are figures like Nikki Parsons. She begins the film as a peripheral ally, a handler from earlier operations, but in this installment she emerges as a conscience. Her quiet defiance, choosing to aid Bourne when doing so jeopardizes her own life, signals that she, too, has reached a limit of obedience. Their bond is marked not by romance, but by recognition. They are two survivors of the same machinery, two souls who have seen the scaffolding of lies and refuse to live under it anymore. Nikki's character arc is subtle but profound. In helping Bourne, she asserts her own humanity against a system that asked her to erase it. She becomes both confidant and mirror, showing us what it looks like to choose decency in a world calibrated for betrayal. Pamela Landy occupies another axis of morality. Introduced as an antagonist in the previous film, she here evolves into one of the trilogy's most compelling characters. She embodies the possibility of integrity within an institution designed to erode it. Watching her wrestle with bureaucratic doublespeak, watching her quietly resist the manipulation of superiors like Noah Vosen, we sense the awakening of conscience. Landy is not naive. She understands the stakes, understands the consequences of stepping out of line, but chooses to act anyway. In her, the film suggests that redemption is not reserved for fugitives like Bourne, but is possible even from within the very halls of power. Then there is Noah Vosen, the antagonist who represents the bureaucratic banality of evil. He is not a villain with a colorful backstory or melodramatic flair. He is chilling precisely because of his ordinariness. His sentences drip with euphemisms. Terminate the asset, neutralize the threat. Language that sanitizes murder into procedure. Vosen is a face of institutional ruthlessness, a man who believes that power justifies itself. He never questions the morality of his orders. To him, efficiency is morality. The film wisely resists painting him as monstrous in demeanor. Instead, it shows us the danger of systems that reward detachment and punish reflection. Vosen is the foil to Bourne's hard-earned humanity. One man who refuses to forget he is human, another who long ago chose to forget. Other characters orbit this core quartet, each adding texture to the moral universe. The assassins sent after Bourne, men like Paz, are not faceless enemies but echoes of his own past. Paz, in particular, becomes symbolic reflection of the Bourne that might have been, unquestioning, lethal, devoid of hesitation. When Bourne spares him, it is not merely mercy but a statement, a refusal to replicate the cycle that created him. In that moment, Bourne's character crystallizes, not as killer or fugitive, but as a man reclaiming agency. The decision not to kill becomes his final act of resistance against the program that tried to strip him of choice. Even minor figures, the journalists, the handlers, the nameless technicians, are drawn with enough detail to remind us that they, too, are cogs in the machinery. The journalist in London, for instance, embodies the peril of truth-seeking in a world hostile to transparency. His brief alliance with Bourne underscores the film's message that information is power, and that power can destroy those who wield it unwisely. The technicians in CIA rooms, calmly shifting satellites and tracing phone calls, reveal how violence can be enacted from sterile spaces far from the sound of gunfire. Each character, no matter how small, participates in the film's exploration of complicity. What emerges from this web of characters is a meditation on choice. Bourne chooses to remember rather than forget. Nikki chooses to risk rather than comply. Landy chooses integrity rather than obedience. Paz chooses life rather than execution. And Vosen chooses procedure over conscience. In this sense, the film is less about espionage than about ethics, less about running than about deciding who we will be when running is no longer possible. For us, literature-loving friends, the brilliance of the Bourne Ultimatum lies in the way its characters embody these choices. Each one a shard of the moral mirror in which we glimpse our own reflections. Literature-loving friends, every time I dig into Bourne Ultimatum, I discover an entire constellation of strange and fascinating facts orbiting it, details that add texture to an already intense cinematic experience. One of the strangest truths is that this third installment was greenlit and begun before the screenplay was even fully finished. Production moved forward on the strength of the franchise's momentum and the confidence that audiences would follow Bourne anywhere. This meant that many scenes were shot with only fragments of script, leaving director Paul Greengrass and his team to improvise structure on the fly. The final film we see, so taut and precise, was in many ways a product of chaos stitched into coherence during editing. It's almost miraculous that a film born of uncertainty could feel so assured in rhythm and style. Then there's the infamous London Waterloo Station sequence, one of the most complex chase scenes ever filmed in a public space. Strange fact, it wasn't closed to the public during shooting. Thousands of commuters were genuinely on their way to work, unaware they were moving through a Hollywood production. Actors, stunt doubles, and camera operators threaded themselves into the real crowd, capturing authenticity at the cost of predictability. Extras were sprinkled in to guide the flow, but most of the people brushing past Bourne and the journalists were genuine Londoners trying to catch trains. The resulting tension, real confusion, real crowd pressure, bled into footage, making the chase pulse with documentary-like immediacy. Another peculiarity lies in the film's global geography. The narrative carries us from Moscow to Madrid, London to Tangier, and finally to New York, but the production often faked locations by shooting in places that only resembled them. Tangier's dazzling rooftop chases, for instance, were partly filmed on constructed sets designed to mimic the city's architecture, but built to withstand stunt work that would have destroyed real homes. Similarly, certain New York interiors were recreated in Berlin, complete with fake skyline glimpses through windows. The illusion of globe hopping was achieved not just by travel but by sleight of hand. Viewers believed they had been whisked around the world, when in reality the geography was a carefully curated collage. The rooftop chase in Tangier holds its own strange trivia. Matt Damon performed the majority of the sequence himself, sprinting across uneven rooftops in heat so blistering that crew members reported camera equipment melting in their hands. At one point, he crashed through a window so forcefully that paramedics were called, though he emerged mostly unscathed. The insurance team balked, but Greengrass insisted on authenticity, declaring that the audience could feel the difference between stunt doubles and real exertion. Damon later confessed that those scenes were among the most physically exhausting of his career. It is rare for a star of his caliber to hurl himself so completely into danger, and rarer still for a studio to allow it. Another curious fact: the film owes its texture to the unconventional editing style of Christopher Rouse, who was cutting scenes almost in real time while production continued. Rouse received raw footage, sculpted it into sequences overnight, and returned them to Greengrass so the team could adjust shooting the next day. This meant the movie was essentially being edited while it was being filmed. The frenetic jump cut style, often imitated, rarely matched, was less a premeditated aesthetic than a survival tactic, bore a necessity in a project whose narrative spine was still evolving. And then there's a strange relationship between the franchise and its lead actor. Matt Damon initially resisted returning for a third film, insisting he would only do so if Greengrass directed. When the director signed on, Damon followed, but both admitted publicly that they had little interest in continuing beyond this installment. The irony, of course, is that the Bourne Ultimatum became the most critically and commercially successful of the trilogy, winning Oscars for editing, sound mixing, and sound editing, and leaving audiences clamoring for more. Damon found himself both liberated and trapped. The actor who had wanted to exit was suddenly cemented as inseparable from the character. Even the music carries odd footnotes. John Powell's score reprises the franchise's signature theme, Extreme Waves by Moby, but with variations that subtly underscore Bourne's arc towards self-realization. The final version of the song, blasting over end credits, became so iconic that it was used in every subsequent Bourne installment. Strange, then, that a techno track from the late 90s, never intended for espionage thrillers, would become shorthand for a global spy saga. One more curiosity: the original ending tested poorly. Audiences were confused by Bourne's confrontation at the training facility and wanted clearer closure. Instead of scrapping the film, Greengrass and Damon reunited months after production wrapped to reshoot crucial scenes in New York, including the rooftop plunge into the river. Those reshoots, done under enormous time pressure, transformed the climax into the haunting finale we know. Without them, the film might have concluded in ambiguity rather than catharsis. All of these strange details, unfinished scripts, real commuters as extras, globe-hopping illusions, editing performed on the fly, res-hot endings, reveal that the Bourne Ultimatum is both meticulously crafted and precariously balanced. It stands as proof that cinema can emerge not from perfect planning, but from adaptability, from the willingness of artists to seize chaos and shape it into coherence. And perhaps it is why the film feels so alive, because it carries within it the unpredictability of the very world it portrays, a world where every shadow may conceal danger and every choice remakes a story. Literature-loving friends, When the Bourne Ultimatum exploded onto screens in 2007, the critical conversation surrounding it was unlike that of almost any other action film of its era. Reviewers didn't just call it thrilling or entertaining. They called it revolutionary, a redefining of what the modern spy thriller could look like. Many pointed out how it arrived in the shadow of post-9/11 anxieties, when surveillance, government overreach, and questions of civil liberties dominated headlines. To watch Jason Bourne elude satellites and government assassins wasn't only escapist spectacle. It was catharsis, a dramatized rebellion against a notion that all-seeing institutions could control human lives with impunity. Critics noted the uncanny way the film tapped into cultural unease, making it not just an action movie, but a parable of resistance. The political subtext became one of the central points of discussion. Writers in major newspapers and journals observed how the CIA's portrayal in the film mirrored real controversies around extraordinary rendition, secret prisons, and the erosion of privacy. Some saw Bourne as a stand-in for citizens who feel trapped in systems they never consented to, forced to live with decisions made in rooms they'll never enter. Scholars of film and politics even argue that Greengrass's verite style, his jittery cameras, rapid cuts, and unsteady focus, capture not just the texture paranoia, but the fractured reality of a world saturated by surveillance. The technique was divisive. Some critics complained of nausea from the constant motion, while others hailed it as a breakthrough, a cinematic language that made the viewer inhabit Bourne's disorientation rather than simply observe it. Another strand of critical perspective emerged from the way the film handled morality. Traditional spy thrillers had often glamorized violence and the suave detachment of their heroes, but Bourne was something else entirely. His fight scenes were quick, brutal, improvisational, but never glamorous. They carried a raw physicality that made every blow feel costly. Critics praised Damon's performance for refusing charm in favor of authenticity. His Bourne wasn't a quick-trading icon like James Bond, but a haunted man clawing back his humanity. This reshaping of the spy archetype ignited debates about masculinity in action cinema. Was Bourne redefining strength as resilience and intelligence rather than bravado? Many thought so, and they saw in him a prototype for a new kind of action hero, weary, skeptical, deeply human. Cultural commentators also linked the film's success to its global sensibility. Unlike earlier action franchises tethered to Western locales, the Bourne Ultimatum flung its story across Moscow, Madrid, Tangier, and New York. This global sprawl wasn't just exotic window dressing. It was a reflection of how interconnected and precarious the world felt in the 2000s. Critics argue that Greengrass transformed these cities into more than backdrops. Each became a character. Each chased a conversation between Bourne and the urban landscape. Rooftops in Tangier, train stations in London, crowded streets in Madrid, all carry their own textures of tension. Scholars have since written about how the film collapses geography, presenting the globe as a chessboard where human beings are pawns of surveillance and power. At film festivals and academic conferences, the movie was often analyzed alongside contemporaneous events. Some noted the resonance of its release during debates over the Patriot Act in the United States. Others remarked on how the scenes of CIA operatives tracking Bourne through cameras and phone calls echoed real revelations about intelligence overreach, particularly as whistleblower stories began surfacing. In this sense, the film's events felt less like science fiction than thinly veiled commentary. Critics marveled at the audacity of a Hollywood blockbuster engaging so directly with issues of state secrecy and human rights, while still delivering popcorn thrills. Audience reactions, too, became a critical event in themselves. The film's opening weekend shattered expectations, demonstrating that viewers didn't just want escapism. They wanted stories that acknowledged the world's fractures. Message boards and early blogs buzzed with discussions about how real the action felt, how it made people suspicious of cameras in public spaces, how it turned subway stations into sites of imagined paranoia. In classrooms, professors began teaching it as a text alongside political theory, pairing it with Foucault's writings on surveillance or Arendt's meditations on bureaucratic evil. The film's presence spilled out of theaters into broader intellectual culture, proving that action cinema could sustain serious discourse. There were detractors, of course. Some traditionalists lamented the abandonment of glamour and spectacle for grit and immediacy. Others criticized the relentless editing as obscuring rather than revealing. A handful of reviewers argued that by demonizing institutions wholesale, the film risks cynicism without offering solutions. But even the negative reviews acknowledged its impact, conceding that Greengrass had altered the grammar of action cinema in ways that would echo through imitators for years. Indeed, later spy films and even the James Bond franchise itself adopted elements of the Bourne style, a critical testament to its influence. When award season arrived, the film's 3 Oscars for editing and sound validated what critics had long argued, that the Bourne Ultimatum was more than genre entertainment. It was craft elevated to commentary, form fused with content. Reviewers often marveled at how the sound design placed us inside Bourne's head, heartbeats accelerating, city hums morphing into threats, silence deployed like a weapon. They saw in these techniques a new way of aligning viewer perception with character psychology. In hindsight, critical consensus has only grown kinder. Scholars writing years later still cite the film as a turning point in cinematic realism, a fusion of political critique and visceral action. It stands in the canon not only as the most celebrated of the Bourne trilogy, but as one of the defining action films of the 2000s. The strange alchemy of chaos behind the scenes and precision on the screen became, in critical circles, a parable of how cinema itself works. Fragmented, unstable, yet capable of producing meaning that resonates across borders and decades. For us, literature-loving friends, what lingers is the way critics and audiences alike recognize that this wasn't simply about a man on the run. It was about all of us, in an age when information could be weaponized, when privacy could vanish at the click of a mouse, when identity itself felt precarious. That is why the movie remains not just an event of its release year, but a critical event of the century's first decade, a cultural mirror that reflected our anxieties back to us with brutal clarity. Literature-loving friends, the production story of the Bourne Ultimatum is as breathless and improbable as the film itself, a patchwork of improvisation, global logistics, and last-minute reinvention that somehow yielded one of the most cohesive thrillers ever put to screen. At its heart was Paul Greengrass, a director whose commitment to immediacy bordered on obsession. His insistence on handheld cameras, on-location shoots, and constant motion meant that actors, stunt performers, and crew lived in a state of near-permanent adrenaline. There was little glamour on this set. The work was sweaty, unpredictable, and endlessly taxing, yet from that crucible came images so raw they felt stolen from reality. The production unfolded across multiple continents, turning the film into a logistical feat that rivaled its narrative scale. Shooting began in Berlin, which doubled for Moscow and Madrid thanks to its architecture and adaptable urban layouts. Crews transformed familiar streets into new countries with signage, lighting, and extras, creating an illusion of globe hopping while saving time and cost. The Real Madrid sequences were spliced with Berlin interiors, stitched together in editing to trick the eye into believing the geography was seamless. In London, the infamous Waterloo station chase was staged without shutting down the terminal, forcing Matt Damon and Paddy Considine to weave through thousands of rail commuters while dozens of hidden cameras captured the chaos. Crew members later joked that the unpredictability of Londoners, who would stop and stare at Damon mid-take, was more dangerous than the stunt work. Tangier provided perhaps the most spectacular backdrop, with production crews negotiating with local authorities to film rooftop chases that required constructing reinforced pathways above fragile homes. Some houses had centuries-old beams incapable of supporting the weight of stuntmen and equipment. So false rooftops were discreetly added, blending seamlessly with the cityscape. Damon hurled himself across these improvised structures in heat that regularly soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, performing stunts so risky the insurance team nearly shut down filming. One infamous crash through a window left him with bruises that appeared on screen, blurring the line between performance and punishment. The authenticity Greengrass demanded came at a physical cost, but the result is an action sequence still studied for its intensity. Editing became its own production saga. Christopher Rouse, the film's editor, was so integral that Greengrass described him as the second director. Rouse worked at breakneck speed, cutting footage almost in real time, so that the crew could adjust strategy day by day. This unusual process meant that the film's rhythm, its frantic jump cuts and disorienting immediacy, was born not in post-production, but in the heat of shooting. Strange as it sounds, the editing style that would win the Academy Award was essentially improvised alongside the camera work, a marriage of chaos and craft that became the film's defining signature. Budgetary pressures loomed constantly. Universal Pictures greenlit the project without a fully locked script, banking on the franchise's momentum and Damon's star power. Scenes were sometimes written the night before they were shot, with dialogue adjusted on set to match the actor's instincts. Damon himself confessed in interviews that he often began a day's work without knowing exactly how his character's arc would unfold, relying on Greengrass's assurance that we'll find it in the cut. This precarious method could have produced incoherence, but instead it imbued the performances with urgency. Actors didn't play knowing the outcome. They played in real uncertainty, which mirrored the paranoia of their characters. Fun facts pepper this chaotic journey. Moby's Extreme Ways, which plays over closing credits, had become such an inseparable part of the Bourne identity that the musician re-recorded it specifically for this film, lending it a darker, more atmospheric tone. In Tangier, locals were so intrigued by the rooftop spectacle that entire families gathered on their own roofs to watch Damon sprint past, turning the chase into a neighborhood festival. The New York climax, meanwhile, was a reshoot added months after principal photography wrapped. Early test screenings left audiences unsatisfied with the ending, so Greengrass and Damon regrouped in Manhattan with a skeleton crew to film the rooftop plunge and river escape. Ironically, what was once an afterthought became one of the trilogy's most iconic closing images. Behind the camera, the camaraderie of the crew often contrasted with the on-screen paranoia. Damon was known for defusing tension with jokes between takes, though he grew frustrated with the punishing pace, at one point telling interviewers he'd never return for a fourth film. Greengrass, meanwhile, nurtured loyalty by encouraging improvisation from everyone, from stunt coordinators to sound designers, making the set feel less like a hierarchy and more like a collective experiment. This openness led to small accidents becoming part of the final cut. A gun jamming mid-fight was left in heightened realism, while an unscripted stumble during a rooftop chase underscored Bourne's vulnerability. Award season later validated the madness. The film swept technical categories at the Oscars, a triumph for a production that had often felt one mishap away from collapse. Crew members later admitted that they didn't fully understand what they were making until they saw it finished, when the fragments they captured fused into a story that felt both urgent and timeless. That sense of disbelief, how did this chaos become such coherence, remains one of the strangest and most endearing facts of all. For us, literature-loving friends, these production stories remind us that art often emerges not from perfection, but from adaptation. The film's fractured process mirrors Bourne's own fractured identity, and just as he stitched himself back together from fragments, so too did Greengrass and his crew stitch a masterpiece from uncertainty. It is fitting that a story about reclaiming humanity from chaos was itself born in chaos, proof that sometimes the very conditions that seem impossible are the ones that yield brilliance. Literature-loving friends, one of the most striking features of the Bourne Ultimatum is the way its settings are not mere backdrops, but active forces shaping the rhythm of the story, each environment pressing down on Bourne as both cage and weapon. Unlike films that indulge in picturesque exoticism, this one treats cities as organisms, alive with surveillance, obstacles, and textures that mold the character's every move. From the snow-dusted shadows of Moscow to the heat-shimmering rooftops of Tangier and the cold gleam of New York skyscrapers, each location pulses with personality of its own, each one asking the same question. Can a human being remain unseen in a world where every surface seems to have eyes? The Moscow prologue feels claustrophobic. Gray streets slick with ice, lights flickering in half-abandoned corridors. It is less a city than a mirror of Bourne's state of mind, fragmented, battered, limping toward survival. From there, Madrid and Berlin unfold as spaces of transition, places where information is sought and alliances formed, their narrow hallways and cramped apartments intensifying a sense that nowhere is neutral ground. Even in interiors, offices, stairwells, anonymous flats, the walls seem to close in, every angle suggesting a trap. The camera drinks in peeling paint, dirty glass, subway grime, crafting a palette of realism that resists the glossy artificiality of typical espionage films. These are not tourist postcards. They are pressure cookers. London's Waterloo Station provides one of the most unforgettable settings, a cavernous space transformed into a labyrinth of paranoia. Normally a place of transience and ordinariness, Commuters rushing for trains, announcements echoing through the air. It becomes under Greengrass's lens a hive of surveillance. The high glass ceilings pour light onto restless bodies, yet even in the brightness there is menace. Cameras swivel, agents close in, and anonymity becomes impossible. What makes this sequence extraordinary is its grounding in everyday. Everyone has been in a station, pressed by the crowd, scanning timetables. The familiarity breeds unease when layered with the knowledge that unseen eyes are watching from afar. London is no longer a city but a net, and Bourne, though more cunning than most, is still caught within its threads. Tangier erupts like a fever dream, the sun bleaching every wall, the rooftops tilting into infinity. This setting is kinetic by design, forcing the chase upward and outward, transforming the city into a vertical chessboard where speed and improvisation dictate survival. Unlike the gray corridors of Europe, Tangier's warmth masks peril. The vibrant market colors, the clamor of motorbikes, the labyrinthine alleys all conceal ambushes. When Bourne leaps from roof to roof, glass shattering beneath his weight, we feel not only the exhilaration of movement, but also the fragility of terrain. Rooftops threaten collapse, alleys choke with noise, walls slice sightlines into fragments. Tangier's setting is almost mythic, a city of light and dust where identity itself is always one corner away from obliteration. Finally, New York becomes both climax and contradiction. Sleek towers and steel bridges suggest authority, permanence, control. It is the epicenter of the system Bourne is fought against, a place where his name has been erased and rewritten on dossiers filed away in shadowy offices. Yet in the film's final act, the city is reclaimed as stage for his rebirth. The sterile interiors of CIA facilities, lined with glass and glowing screens, embody the bureaucratic detachment of power, while the nighttime streets outside hum with restless life. The contrast between fluorescent-lit offices and the rushing Hudson River underscores the battle between artificial order and natural resilience. When Bourne plunges into the water, it feels less like an escape and more like a baptism, as if New York itself has yielded him back to humanity. Cinematically, these settings are elevated through Greengrass's signature style. The handheld camera, restless and unsteady, refuses the viewer the luxury of detachment. We are jostled through crowds, sprinted across rooftops, and slammed into concrete alongside Bourne. The rapid edits, often criticized as dizzying, mimic the way environments assault the senses when adrenaline floods perception. We don't see cities, we experience them in fragments, faces blurred, doors swinging, light flaring through glass. The sound design intensifies its immersion. The hum of fluorescent bulbs in CIA offices, the echo of footsteps in tile corridors, the cacophony of markets and motorbikes in Tangier. Every sound is chosen not to decorate but to destabilize, to remind us that in Bourne's world, peace is always fleeting. Color palettes deepen this environmental storytelling. The muted grays and cold blues of Europe emphasize bureaucracy and oppression, while the sun-bleached yellows and oranges of Tangier vibrate with chaotic energy. New York's cool metallics symbolize surveillance and control, yet the darkness of its night skies makes room for the possibility of escape. The film does construct a geography of paranoia where color, sound, and motion intertwine. The viewer is trained to look over their shoulder, to distrust every corner, to wonder whether anonymity is possible in modern space. For us, literature-loving friends, the film's settings and cinematic elements remind us that place is never neutral in storytelling. Each city becomes a metaphor, each wall and street carrying psychological weight. Moscow whispers of trauma, London roars of surveillance. Tangier burns with volatility, New York gleams of control, yet hides liberation in its depths. To watch Bourne navigate these landscapes is to witness a man wrestling not just with enemies, but with environments themselves, each one a riddle-demanding solution. The film transformed geography into narrative, architecture into antagonist, and in doing so, teaches us that sometimes a stage is as powerful a character as any hero or villain. Literature-loving friends, slipping behind the curtain of the Bourne Ultimatum is like discovering a second film, one made of accidents, anxieties, and improvisations that somehow coalesce into the taut masterpiece we know. The official narrative of the movie is Jason Bourne's reclamation of identity. The unofficial narrative of its making is a crew and cast clawing coherence out of chaos, a behind-the-scenes odyssey that mirrors the very themes of control, surveillance, and resistance the story dramatizes. The first secret lies in the script, or rather, in its absence. The screenplay was unfinished when cameras rolled, a fact Damon later joked about in interviews, claiming that much of the performance was grounded in trust rather than knowledge. Scenes were sketched in outlines, dialogue penciled hours before shooting, arcs rearranged in the editing room. Writers Tony Gilroy, Scott Z. Burns, and George Nolfi came and went, reshaping drafts as production advanced, leaving Greengrass to function as ringmaster of narrative improvisation. That the final film feels so tightly wound is testament to the alchemy of editing, where fragments became symphony. On set, Greengrass cultivated an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. His insistence on handheld cameras wasn't just a stylistic flourish, but a philosophy. He wanted the cast to feel hunted even by the lens. Cameramen were told to intrude into actors' personal space, to stumble after them, to allow focus to slip and then snap back. This created an energy that actors initially found disorienting but soon embraced. Damon, used to more traditional framing, discovered that his best moments came when he stopped performing for camera and simply lived in the moment. The lens, restless and breathing, captured him in fragments that later stitched together into intensity. One story crew members love to tell is how Damon's bruises and exhaustion often made their way directly onto the screen. The Tangier rooftop chase, so iconic, left him scraped raw, with cuts across his hands and face that makeup departments barely concealed. Rather than hide them, Greengrass leaned into reality, allowing Bourne's physical toll to reflect Damon's own. Even the stunt where Damon crashes through a window, done without a double, left the stars shaken and the crew briefly panicked. The authenticity of that glass-shattering moment remains one of the trilogy's rawest images because it wasn't entirely staged. Waterloo Station provided its own behind-the-scenes lore. Universal had hoped to close the station for controlled filming, but British authorities refused, forcing the crew to stage one of the most elaborate chase sequences ever attempted amid live commuters. Tiny cameras were hidden inside luggage, sealing rafters, even fake newspaper stands. Damon and Considine rehearsed movements dozens of times, but the true test came in throwing themselves into crowds of real travelers who had no idea a Hollywood production unfolded around them. Greengrass directed via earpieces, whispering instructions while simultaneously tracking multiple cameras. The chaos was genuine, the confusion authentic. The resulting tension owed as much to London's daily bustle as to cinematic craft. Another hidden struggle lay in sound. Because Greengrass's handheld method often prevented boom mics from staying in frame, much of the dialogue and ambient noise had to be recreated in post-production. Foley artists became unsung heroes, slamming doors, rattling train doors, layering in footsteps that matched Damon's frantic strides. Even the sound of his breathing, recorded in studio, was meticulously mixed to convey exhaustion without melodrama. The Academy Awards for sound editing and mixing were no accident. They were acknowledgement of an invisible army who turned fragmented scraps of audio into an immersive sonic experience. Perhaps the strangest behind-the-scenes twist was the film's ending. The initial cut concluded differently, leaving test audiences dissatisfied. Greengrass and Damon regrouped months later to reshoot crucial New York sequences, including Bourne's rooftop plunge into the Hudson. This guerrilla-style reshoot used a lean crew and tight secrecy, yet produced the most indelible image of the trilogy, Bourne sinking into water, reborn. Without that last-minute decision, the film might have ended in ambiguity rather than catharsis. Crew anecdotes further reveal the camaraderie and exhaustion of the shoot. Damon, known for self-deprecating humor, lightened tense days by mocking his own fighting style, or joking about Greengrass's obsession with shaky cameras. Julia Stiles, though appearing briefly, spoke of how Greengrass encouraged her to invent emotional beats for Nicky Parsons that deepened her quiet rebellion. Joan Allen, playing Pamela Landy, recalled how she was told to deliver lines in multiple moral registers, one complicit, one defiant, so Greengrass could decide later in the cut which moral shade emphasize. Actors became collaborators, surrendering ego to the collective process of discovery. Behind the glamour of international sets, however, exhaustion gnawed at everyone. Long days in punishing climates, constant travel, endless retakes. all took their toll. Damon admitted publicly that he doubted he could endure another film under such conditions. Crew members described themselves as wired and wrecked, exhilarated yet drained. Yet the adversity became part of the film's DNA. Just as Bourne refuses collapsed despite exhaustion, so too did production refuse to break, channeling weariness into energy. When the film finally premiered, those behind-the-scenes struggles vanished into the seamlessness of the finished product. Critics marveled at the coherence, without realizing how fragile it had been. For those who lived it, the experience became legend, proof that art can be born from instability, that the line between chaos and craft is thinner than we imagine. In its own way, the making of the Bourne Ultimatum mirrored Bourne's journey, haunted, pursued, fractured, yet ultimately whole. Literature-loving friends, the Bourne Ultimatum may announce itself as an action thriller, but beneath its breakneck momentum lies a dense lattice of themes and symbols that give the film its intellectual and emotional staying power. The surface is all chases, surveillance screens, and brutal hand-to-hand fights. But just beneath, the movie whispers a quieter set of questions. Who are we when memory betrays us? What does it mean to live inside systems that erase and rewrite identity? Can the reclamation of self stand as a rebellion against machinery designed to crush individuality? The most obvious theme, and the one that drives every frame, is identity and memory. Bourne's fractured recollections symbolize the way modern individuals can be dislocated from their origins, their histories fragmented by forces larger than themselves. His pursuit of truth is less about discovering facts than about stitching together a narrative that can hold meaning. Every dossier page, every flashback to the training facility, every whispered name is a puzzle piece. The fact that the pieces, once assembled, reveal his own complicity makes the theme sharper. Memory is not only liberating but damning. To remember is to confront guilt, to face the uncomfortable knowledge that we are both victims and agents of our pasts. Closely tied to this is the theme of power and surveillance. The film's CIA operatives monitor him with satellites, phone intercepts, and digital grids, conjuring a world where anonymity is nearly impossible. Surveillance here becomes a symbol of dehumanization. Individuals reduced to assets, lives calculated as collateral. Yet the paradox is that Bourne himself resists reduction. No matter how much data the agency collects, they cannot predict the instincts of a man reclaiming his autonomy. The symbol of the camera lens, constantly cutting to CCTV feeds, grainy images of crowds, becomes a visual reminder of the struggle between human unpredictability and mechanical control. In this way, every chase scene doubles as metaphor, the human body darting through the gaps of a net cast by machines. Another rich theme is guilt and redemption. Bourne's final revelation, that he once consented to become the very weapon he now despises, forces him into confrontation with his own culpability. Symbolically, his baptism in the Hudson River at the film's end can be read as purification. Water becomes motif throughout the trilogy, but here it functions as absolution, immersion not only in escape, but in cleansing. The choice not to kill Paz, the assassin who mirrors his former self, serves as sacrament of redemption. By refusing to replicate violence, he reclaims moral agency. The rooftop encounter thus becomes less about physical survival than about ethical rebirth. Systems versus individuals forms another thematic current. Vosen represents bureaucratic banality, a man who cloaks murder in procedure. Landy represents the possibility of integrity within systems, her faxing of Blackbriar documents a symbolic leak of truth into the bloodstream of public knowledge. Bourne, by contrast, embodies resistance, a single body refusing erasure. The triangulation of these figures suggests that institutions are not monoliths but contested spaces, where complicity and conscience wrestle. Symbolically, the sterile offices of CIA, walls of glass, glowing monitors, stand as temples of control, while the messy rooftops, train stations, and markets where Bourne fights are temples of chaos and humanity. The film thus dramatizes a moral geography, order as oppression, disorder as freedom. Even the film's violence is symbolic. Unlike glossy action cinema, the fights here are stripped of glamour, emphasizing improvisation, books, towels, fists used as weapons. Violence functions as symbol of survival, stripped of spectacle. It reminds us that life within systems of control reduces humans to tools, yet also that humans can turn anything into tool for resistance. The brutality of these scenes, their lack of polish, reflects the authenticity of Bourne's struggle. They are not celebrations of violence, but metaphors for persistence. A subtler theme runs through the supporting characters. The cost of proximity to truth, the journalists in London, the allies who risk helping Bourne, all pay a price for touching knowledge. Symbolically, the film suggests that truth is radioactive, burning those who handle it. In an era of whistleblowers and leaks, this theme resonates even more powerfully. To know is to endanger, yet ignorance is complicity. Cinematically, symbols are woven into color and sound. The grays and blues of European sequences symbolize oppression and institutional coldness. The golden light of Tangier, though beautiful, symbolizes volatility, heat that blisters rather than comforts. New York's sterile metallic palette becomes emblem of bureaucratic power, yet the darkness of its river offers renewal. Sound, too, carries symbolic weight. The echo of footsteps in stations symbolizes pursuit, the sudden silences symbolize mortality, and the recurrent thrum of Moby's extreme ways over the credits becomes an anthem of survival. Ultimately, the deepest theme of the Bourne Ultimatum is freedom through choice. Bourne's arc culminates not in spectacular revenge, but in refusal. The refusal to kill, the refusal to vanish into systems, the refusal to surrender his humanity. Symbolically, the final shot of his body stirring in water tells us that survival is not just physical but moral. The man is alive because he has reclaimed himself. For us, literature-loving friends, this is why the film lingers. Its symbols and themes remind us that we, too, live within systems of surveillance and control, that we, too, wrestle with fragmented memories and complicity. Bourne's journey dramatizes a universal truth, that freedom is not given, it is chosen, and that the greatest rebellion is remembering who we are when others would rather we forget. Literature-loving friends, when we turn our gaze to filmmaking techniques of the Bourne Ultimatum, we encounter work that rewrote the grammar of action cinema, introducing a style so distinctive it would ripple across Hollywood for years afterward. Greengrass's handheld camera, Christopher Rouse's kinetic editing, John Powell's percussive score, and Damon's subdued yet visceral performance fused into a cinematic language that embodied the paranoia of its age. To analyze these choices is to realize how form and content intertwine so seamlessly that the very texture of the film, the way it looks, moves, and sounds, became inseparable from its themes of surveillance, identity, and control. The camera, restless and unsteady, is perhaps the film's most recognizable technique. Eschewing the smooth pans and steady dollies of conventional action, Greengrass insisted on verite-style cinematography that thrust viewers into the immediacy of the moment. Scenes at Waterloo Station, for example, are filmed as though the cameraman were another anxious commuter, catching glimpses of Bourne from the corner of the eye. In Tangier, the camera tumbles with him across rooftops, sometimes losing focus, sometimes cutting off the frame, mimicking the chaos of pursuit. This aesthetic, criticized by some as shaky cam, was defended by others as revolutionary. It refused to aestheticize violence, instead placing the audience inside the disorientation of a hunted man. Symbolically, the jittery lens mirrored the instability of identity itself. Fragmented, unsettled, impossible to pin down. Editing amplified this effect. Christopher Rouse's rapid cuts defied traditional continuity, slicing time into fragments that demanded the audience's active reconstruction. Action was not presented as spectacle, but as puzzle. The viewers had to assemble meaning from shards, just as Bourne assembled his past from fragments of memory. This was not incoherence, but method. The editing style itself was narrative. Rouse's work won him the Academy Award, a recognition of how craft could embody theme. His choices turned paranoia into experience, making audiences feel watched, pursued, and destabilized in their very seats. Sound design further deepened immersion. Every footstep, door slam, and gas was exaggerated yet grounded, creating an oral map of paranoia. Silence was deployed as weapon. Moments when sound dropped out, when the hum of surveillance cut to nothing, became more terrifying than explosions. John Powell's score, with its pounding percussion and minimalist motifs, avoided lush melodies in favor of rhythm, music that pulsed like a racing heart. And of course, Moby's Extreme Ways, reprised and re-recorded, became the unofficial anthem of Bourne's rebirth. its electronic drive embodying survival against machinery. Lighting and color design added subtler touches. Moscow scenes bled cold blues and grays, embodying trauma and disorientation. Tangiers seared with golden light, oppressive heat, and chaotic saturation, reflecting volatility. New York gleamed with metallic coldness, symbol of bureaucracy, until the river's dark waters offered relief. These choices reinforce a narrative without announcing themselves. Emotions encoded in palette. Performance style was another crucial technique. Damon's acting avoided the quips and flamboyance of action heroes. He communicated exhaustion through silences, guilt through stillness, determination through the tight set of his jaw. Joan Allen's restrained delivery, Julia Stiles' understated glances, David Strathairn's clipped efficiency, all embody the film's ethos of realism. Characters felt like people caught in machinery, not archetypes fulfilling genre beats. Technically, the film also broke ground in its use of real-world locations. Shooting in functioning train stations, crowded streets, and authentic rooftops lent a documentary realism. Scenes staged among real commuters or within living neighborhoods infused authenticity impossible to fabricate on a soundstage. Greengrass's insistence on physical presence over green screen turned environments into participants in the narrative. From a box office perspective, these techniques paid off handsomely. Released in August 2007, the film debuted to $69 million in North America, a staggering opening that set a new high for the franchise. Globally, it earned over $440 million, transforming a relatively modest spy series into a cultural juggernaut. It outperformed both of its predecessors, proving that audiences hungered not only for spectacle, but for stories that acknowledged the instability of the world they inhabited. At a time when franchises like James Bond were pivoting toward darker realism, with Casino Royale just a year before, the Bourne Ultimatum provided a blueprint. Grit over glamour, authenticity over artifice. Critically and commercially, the film's techniques were vindicated. Some detractors dismissed the jittery camera work as nausea-inducing, yet the overwhelming consensus recognized its innovation. The Academy rewarded it with 3 Oscars, editing, sound mixing, and sound editing, cementing its status as both popular and artistic triumph. For Universal Pictures, the box office number secured Bourne as one of its crown jewels, and for the industry, it recalibrated what audiences would accept and expect from spy thrillers. For us, literature-loving friends, the filmmaking of the Bourne Ultimatum reminds us that technique is never neutral. Every restless cut, every blurred frame, every heartbeat in the sound mix was a narrative choice, a reflection of the film's central question. Can a man stitch coherence out of fragmentation? The answer lies not only in Bourne's survival, but in the survival of the film's daring techniques, which reshaped action cinema and linger as symbols of an age when chaos demanded its own cinematic language. Literature-loving friends, when we turn our focus to the cast of the Bourne Ultimatum, we encounter a gathering of performers who seem to understand instinctively that their task was not to overshadow the chaos of the film's world, but to inhabit it, to lend humanity and texture. Matt Damon, of course, sits at the center, not only as Jason Bourne, but as the embodiment of a new kind of action hero. By the time this 3rd installment arrived, Damon had grown so comfortable in the role that he spoke of Bourne as a second skin, a figure who allowed him to channel exhaustion, discipline, and doubt in equal measure. In interviews, Damon often emphasized that he saw Bourne less as a superhero than as a tragic figure, someone grappling with guilt rather than basking in triumph. He noted that the hardest part of the trilogy was not the physicality, though the bruises and scrapes were real, but the demand for silence, playing a man whose words were few and whose emotions surface in restrained gestures rather than speeches. That choice, Damon suggested, was what gave Bourne resonance. He reflected the unspoken anxieties of a generation. Julia Stiles, reprising her role as Nikki Parsons, took what had been a marginal figure in earlier films and infused her with quiet defiance. Stiles admitted in interviews that she was initially unsure of how significant her character would be in the 3rd installment, but Greengrass encouraged her play Nikki as a woman awakening to conscience, someone who could no longer compartmentalize her complicity in the program. The subtle glances, the protective instincts toward Bourne, the decision to stand with him, all were choices born of determination to give Nikki depth without melodrama. Audiences noticed, What could have been a minor supporting role became a moral compass. Joan Allen, returning as Pamela Landy, likewise leaned into restraint. In conversations with journalists, she described her approach as playing the pauses. Landy's integrity emerges not through grand speeches, but through hesitation, the moments when her eyes flicker with doubt, when her hand hesitates before signing a document. Allen spoke of how she wanted Landy to represent the possibility of goodness inside corruption, a character whose small acts of resistance suggested that even within institutions, humanity could survive. Viewers responded strongly, praising her as one of the trilogy's most complex figures, a woman who refuses to be swallowed by bureaucracy. David Strathairn, as Noah Vosen, provided the opposite pole, calm bureaucratic menace. Strathairn explained in interviews that he deliberately avoided playing Vosen as outwardly villainous. Instead, he focused on efficiency, on the conviction that his character truly believed he was doing what was necessary. This decision made Vosen chilling, not because he reveled in cruelty, but because he rendered it procedural. Critics noted the brilliance of this choice. Vosen was not a monster in the shadows, but a man at a desk, turning termination into paperwork. Other supporting players left their marks. Edgar Ramírez, as Paz, spoke of how he prepared by studying soldiers who had been conditioned to obey without question. His rooftop standoff with Bourne became one of the film's emotional peaks precisely because he embodied what Bourne might have remained had he not broken free. Paddy Considine, as a journalist in London, lent desperation to a brief but pivotal role. His portrayal reminded audiences of the stakes of truth in a world that silences it violently. Even Albert Finney, appearing late as Dr. Hirsch, imbued his few scenes with unsettling calm, presenting indoctrination as paternal guidance, a choice that amplified the horror of Bourne's origin. Audience reactions to the cast were overwhelmingly positive. Damon's embodiment of Bourne was hailed as career-defining, with viewers praising his ability to convey intensity without bravado. Many spoke of how refreshing it was to see an action hero who didn't rely on one-liners or charisma, but on endurance and thoughtfulness. Allen and Stiles drew admiration for grounding the film in moral complexity, proving that the series wasn't merely a masculine power fantasy, but meditation enriched by female characters who carried conscience and courage. Even critics who disliked Greengrass's restless camera conceded that the performances shone through the visual chaos, giving the film its emotional ballast. In post-release interviews, Damon expressed ambivalence about returning for future installments, citing the physical toll of the role and the narrative completeness of the trilogy. "We've told the story," he said, "and it ends where it should. He knows who he is." That sentiment resonated with audiences who saw the Bourne Ultimatum as both culmination and catharsis. Stiles, for her part, cherished that her character had finally stepped out of the shadows, while Allen spoke of how Landy's moral stand felt almost therapeutic to play in an era of political cynicism. Strathairn noted with amusement that audiences would stop him in airports to scold him for being so mean to Bourne, a testament to how fully viewers had internalized the struggle. Audience reviews on forums and early social media repeatedly highlighted the humanity of the cast. Many wrote that they felt seen in Bourne's exhaustion, his longing for freedom from machinery. Others praised the diversity of moral perspectives embodied by the supporting roles, noting that this was a spy film where no one was reduced to caricature. Fans spoke of re-watching sequences not for action alone, but for glances, silences, and moral fissures that revealed deeper struggles. For us, literature-loving friends, the cast of the Bourne Ultimatum reminds us that action cinema lives and dies not by spectacle alone, but by the truth of its characters. Damon's weary determination, Stiles' awakening conscience, Allen's quiet defiance, Strathairn's procedural menace, all converge to make the film not just a thriller, but a meditation on choice and humanity. And the audience, recognizing themselves in these performances, responded not only with applause, but with a sense of shared reflection, as though the film had given them both adrenaline and mirror. Literature-loving friends, as we draw this long journey with the Bourne Ultimatum to a close, I find myself reflecting on how rare it is for a film to marry adrenaline and philosophy so seamlessly. At first glance, it is a movie of constant motion, chases through crowded stations, leaps across sun-bleached rooftops, collisions in dim corridors, but beneath that restless energy beats a question older than any spy thriller. Who are we when the world tries to define us? In Bourne's journey, we saw not merely a man hunted by agencies, but a man hunted by fragments of memory, fragments of guilt, fragments of self. And in his refusal to surrender, in his insistence on remembering, he gave us a parable about freedom that transcends genre. Looking back, what strikes me most is how the trilogy's final chapter distilled everything into a single narrative arc of reclamation. We watched Bourne limping out of Moscow, hiding in Madrid apartments, whispering through London crowds, clawing across Tangier rooftops, and finally plunging into New York waters. Each setting became not only stage but metaphor. Cities as cages, train stations as nets, rooftops as crucibles, rivers as baptisms. Every place carried symbolic weight, every frame infused with paranoia and possibility. The filmmaking techniques, the jittering camera, the jagged cuts, the pounding soundscape, were not flourishes but embodiment of the themes, a cinematic language invented to express instability and disorientation. It is no wonder that critics spoke of the film as both a masterpiece of action and a mirror of its time, a movie that reflected the surveillance anxieties of the 2000s with frightening precision. And then, of course, there are the characters who gave flesh to the ideas. Damon's Bourne, stripped of bravado yet overflowing with resilience, became the unlikely hero of a new age. Nikki Parsons and Pamela Landy stood as beacons of conscience, proving that morality could survive even in corridors designed to erase it. Noah Vosen reminded us how easily evil could be disguised as procedure. Pa symbolized a fork in the road. What Bourne was, what he might have remained, and what he chose not to be. Each one carried a shard of the film's moral mirror, inviting us to see our own choices reflected there. Behind the camera, chaos reigned. Unfinished scripts, frantic rewrites, injuries on rooftops, live commuters unwittingly drafted into cinema. Yet from that chaos came coherence, a paradox as haunting as the story itself. The production mirrored the narrative, fragments stitched together into wholeness, exhaustion transfigured into triumph. The strangeness of its making only deepens its resonance. When audiences left theaters in 2007, they did so exhilarated not just by spectacle, but by catharsis. They had witnessed not only Bourne's survival, but his rebirth, not only his evasion, but his refusal. The final image, his body sinking, then stirring, alive, was more than a cliffhanger. It was a symbol of resilience, a promise that humanity, though battered and bruised, can never be entirely erased. For us, literature-loving friends, the lesson lingers beyond cinema. The Bourne Ultimatum teaches that identity is not granted by governments or institutions but reclaimed by choice, that guilt can wound but also heal, that freedom is not the absence of pursuit, but the refusal to surrender one's humanity. In a world that often feels like surveillance and procedure threaten to swallow individuality, Bourne's refusal becomes our reminder. To remember is to resist, to choose conscience over convenience, to claim ourselves even when others would erase us. And so, as the credits roll, I leave you with gratitude for sharing this journey, for leaning into the chase with me, for finding in cinema the same mirror I find, a mirror that reflects not only stories but our own restless questions. If this exploration has resonated with you, if you found yourself caught up in Bourne's fractured but unyielding fight for selfhood, then I invite you to stay with me here at Cinema Vault. Like and subscribe, my friends, and together we will keep peeling back the layers of film, always searching for the truths hidden in motion and memory.